We are pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we continue our monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. Today we'll take a look at new research from Zimbabwe. Our next event will be held on December 6th. Stay tuned for the country of interest. We're just finalizing that right now. I'm pleased to introduce our partner, Mr. Bruce Sherman from the Broadcasting Board of Governors, who will set the stage for today's session. Bruce is just back from Southern Africa, so he should have some interesting insights for us this morning. Mr. Sherman is the Director of Strategy and Development at BBG. He joined the BBG in 1996 after 12 years at Radio Marti, the broadcasting service for Cuba. In his role today, he directs formulation and execution of BBG strategy, leading a team of senior managers and planners across all broadcast groups. He has overseen development of the 3 5-year strategic plans, including the most recent 2012-2016, and is their principal author. Sherman has also played a central role in launching new strategic initiatives for the Muslim world, including Radio Sawa and Al Hurra TV for the Middle East and Radio Farda for Iran. These and other strategic initiatives since 2002 have expanded the BBG's worldwide audience from 100 million to over 185 million people weekly. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Sherman.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. My role here is very brief because we want to get right into the presentations. I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming. The BBG sponsors these briefings with Gallup, our partner now in our global research program, so that we can share with you principal findings from the media environments that we're operating in. We are very diligent in studying the context for our broadcasting, our media efforts worldwide. We want to know, of course, how people are consuming media. We want to understand what their preferences are. All of that, of course, sets the stage for the strategies that we develop market by market. For those of you who've been to a few of these briefings thus far, you know that we've touched on some hot button countries, some large, complex places like Iran and Burma. And of course, today we're talking about Zimbabwe, not quite as large a market, but very significant for us because our view is that every place is different. Every set of circumstances varies. We have to take into account local nuance and how different patterns of media consumption are taking place in the markets. We don't, in these briefings, focus on the performance of our broadcasting organizations. This is not a public relations event in which we are touting our reach rates and discussing our performance in great detail. Rather, again, it's about talking about the media environment, and we do this as a public service. Over the years, since we've been doing research, we've been very active in global market and audience research for more than a dozen years. And over that time period, we had many requests to share information about our research with the broader public. We do that in a number of ways. At bbg.gov, you will see reports that carry a lot of our audience research information. And this briefing is part of our effort to be transparent and open with the public about the research that we do. We do this in the spirit of cooperation. We're very interested in what you have to say and think about it, so we'll have a good Q&A session after the briefings. But we also invite you to contact us if you're interested in knowing more about our research, about how we do the research, about the markets that we're covering in that research. We'll be happy to talk to you about that. So with that, we'll turn it over, Chris, and get the presentation started. Thanks again for coming.
Thanks, Bruce. We're going to have 2 presenters today. I'm going to introduce them both at the same time, just in terms of flow. It'll flow a little bit better from that standpoint. Jenna Levy is a consulting specialist here at Gallup. She's recently returned from Zimbabwe on another project, so has some real fresh insights from being on the ground just in the last couple weeks. And so she'll be sharing some of the quantitative findings with us this morning. She specializes in quantitative and qualitative research methodology at Gallup. She's based in Washington, D.C. She designs and manages customized research studies for international projects. Her areas of expertise include questionnaire design, focus groups, and in-depth interview development, and advanced analysis and reporting. Prior to joining Gallup, Levy worked in social science research, providing consultation on methodology and research design, as well as crafting instruments on social and economic issues. She holds a master's degree in survey methodology from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a bachelor's degree in strategic communications from Elon University in North Carolina. Our second presenter is Ms. Sonia Glockel. She is the Africa Research Analyst at the Broadcasting Board of Governors International Broadcasting Bureau. She covers all aspects from research design to analysis of several dozen quantitative and qualitative studies in sub-Saharan Africa each year. Prior to joining the BBG, Sonia was a senior project manager at a research consultancy where she managed quantitative and qualitative projects across Africa, Southeast Asia, the Balkans, and the former Soviet Union. This work was conducted for various international broadcasting clients, including the BBG and other organizations such as the UN, USAID, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She obtained her undergraduate degree in international culture and politics from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown and a certificate from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Sonia holds a master's in politics and communication from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jenna Levy, Ms. Sonia Glockel.
So I'm first going to start off with an overview of our methodology, including details on our data collection and fieldwork, as well as some of our sampling plan. The target population of this study were adults ages 15 and older living in Zimbabwe. Our total final sample size was 1,512 people. Data was collected using face-to-face interviews in respondent homes, and interviews were conducted in the language that people were most comfortable in, English, Shona, and Ndebele. The response rate for the study was 83.2%, and the field period went from July 22nd until August 2nd, 2012. Our field team was comprised of 31 interviewers who were led by 5 supervisors. So here we see a map of the region. Zimbabwe is surrounded by South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique. Zimbabwe itself is comprised of 10 individual provinces, and our sampling plan was developed around this. The sample was first stratified by each of the 10 provinces, and then within province by 6 population-defined strata. And using population proportional allocation, we had 189 primary sampling units, or PSUs, and within each PSU, we conducted 8 interviews, which gave us our sample size of 1,512. To allow for randomization at the household level, we used the Kish method of respondent selection. And I also wanted to mention PSUs at the urban level were neighborhoods or wards, while in rural areas, they were villages or smaller townships. So as many of us know, conducting survey research in this part of the world is never an easy task. In Zimbabwe, this was further complicated by some unique challenges that our interviewers faced. Due to the political instability and lack of trust in strangers that's happening in Zimbabwe right now, respondents were very wary to participate and also to provide truthful answers. Also, our interviewers faced some opposition from the ZANU-PF, which is the current political party, and their youth force would inquire and harass the interviewers for documentation and paperwork throughout the field period. Also, our interviewers found that respondents were assuming that the Zimbabwean government was involved with this study and that they wanted to collect research for the state-controlled broadcaster ZBC, which was not the case. Our team also faced some logistical obstacles. This included in rural areas having chiefs or headmen wanting extra permission, extra documentation, which required our people to have to travel long distances to get that. So that had some logistical effects on the field period. So now I'm going to start with some overview of the media landscape from this study. The media landscape in Zimbabwe is in many ways very traditional, but we also have seen some evidence that Zimbabweans are actually relying on a more unique mix of media for news and information than we might have thought. Additionally, you'll see throughout here that the different subgroups have varying levels of access and usage. So while conventional thinking would have us believe that radio would be the most common type of source of equipment Zimbabweans would have at home, we actually see that newer media is actually pretty established. See on the left side that mobile phone usage, or mobile phone access, is at 76%. And also, 47% of Zimbabweans report having a television in their home. Radio is pretty consistent at 60%, which is pretty consistent with what we would think. Another thing that we saw interesting in terms of access was that while 10% report having a computer in the home, 19% report having internet access at home, which suggests that people might be accessing the internet from their mobile devices as well. So here we see a divide in regular access to several sources of media between those living in urban and rural areas. There seems to be the most significant gaps when looking specifically at TV and internet access. City dwellers are much more likely to have a TV and internet access in their homes compared to those living in more rural areas. So although, as we just mentioned, that the proportions of those who have access to newer media are actually quite high throughout Zimbabwe, Zimbabweans are still turning to more traditional sources of media to get news and information. So as you can see here, the high levels of at least weekly access to family and friends, as well as radio, are still very high, and they're still the highest forms of ways that people are getting their news. This signifies that while certain segments of the population have indeed embraced new media, radio and word of mouth cannot be ignored and cannot be counted out of any type of media platforms. They're still the primary ways that Zimbabweans are turning to get their news. So also going along with what we might expect, traditional media such as sharing among family and friends and radio are the most commonly accessed form of news in rural Zimbabwe. Radio and word of mouth are still quite popular in urban areas, although city dwellers are also using different forms such as magazines and newspapers, TV, SMS text messaging, as you see, is very high in urban, 86% reporting getting news from SMS, as well as internet, social networking, and even relatively high percentage of mobile apps of 29% versus 11% in rural. So here we see the breakdown of ethnicity. Basically, the Ndebele are much more likely than the Shona to get their news from family and friends by sharing information within their social networks. Whereas we see Shona speakers have more of a mix of how they get news. So this data I found very interesting. Contrary to what we might have expected to see, radio is actually consistent in how people get their news, at least weekly, among all age groups, including the youth. We probably would have thought we would seen a drop in the radio usage as we saw an increase in newer media such as TV, internet, and mobile. However, even the youth are still turning to radio to get their news on a regular basis. But we also can see, looking at TV usage, there's not much difference between 15 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds, but there is that significant drop for those 35 and older. And this really illustrates the very recent increase in popularity in TV in Zimbabwe for getting information. The same trends can be seen when you look at internet and mobile apps, but the decreasing proportions of use among those 25 and older are much more defined. So this, again, illustrates just how new internet and mobile is to the country. So over the past 10 years, satellite television has become an increasingly popular way for Zimbabweans to access news and information. As Zimbabweans search for alternatives to the state-controlled national broadcaster, ZBC, many rely on television to learn about current events at the local, national, and international level. Among those who reported having a television at home, 2 out of 3 report having their own individual satellite dish. This is significant because, as you can see, satellite TV has really reached a similar saturation level as the more traditional form of watching television, which is using an antenna. So satellite TV is growing, as we'll hear from Sonia, and it's not going anywhere. So as you can see here, satellite dish ownership is not limited to a certain demographic group or specific subgroup. It is, however, most prevalent among those who have higher education and who live in an urban area, and this is to be expected. We also see something interesting, that dish ownership is pretty consistent among all the age groups besides the 55 and older, which also goes along with what we would expect to see. So while I was on the ground in Zimbabwe for some of our qualitative work there, we heard a lot about the high cost of paying for satellite TV subscriptions. The average subscription in Zimbabwe could cost a household between $40 and $60 per month, depending on the bundle of channels received and the location you are in the country. As one woman in Harare told me, the average Zimbabwe simply cannot afford this kind of monthly cost. So it is no surprise to see here that only 1/4 of Zimbabweans are paying for this extra access, for extra programming. 3/4 of people are accessing satellite TV using free-to-air channels from other countries such as South Africa, Zambia, and Botswana. We also heard a lot about satellite technicians providing people with these free access codes that people would type in their codes to their decoder, and that's how they get the channels from these other satellites. So just who are these Zimbabweans who are paying extra? So this 1/4 of the population who are paying for these satellite TV subscriptions. As expected, highly educated Zimbabweans with higher incomes make up the 26% who report paying for extra channels. Specifically, 44% of college graduates and 40% of those who say they are living comfortably on their present income also report paying for satellite TV. So this kind of goes along with this trend. Additionally, we see that Shona are twice as likely as Ndebele to pay extra. So here we see the breakdown of the type of decoder that Zimbabweans report having in their households. As you can see, WizTech is the most prevalent at 46%, compared to DSTV, which is in second at 28%. The thing to note here is that DSTV requires a subscription before the decoder can be activated, so this is the one that requires this extra cost. So again, people that we spoke to in both urban and rural areas insisted that the DSTV subscription costs are just too expensive, but that if they could afford it, or if the costs were reduced, then they would, in fact, move over to DSTV to get their satellite TV because it offers more reliability, more choice, more programming. And that's something that we heard a lot about, that Zimbabweans are really searching for this alternative media. They want more information about things that are really going on in the world. So it's very important to Zimbabweans to have access to this media. But looking at WizTech is the free-to-air option that gives them the most access to all the different satellites and channels that they would like to have for free. And also just consistent with the demographics of those who said they paid extra for channels, those who reported having a DSTV decoder are also those with higher levels of education and higher incomes. Just a quick statistic, among college graduates, 45% reported using DSTV compared to 32% of graduates who had a WizTech decoder. So now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Sonia Glauco from BBG to talk about new media, internet, and mobile phone use, as well as provide you guys with some recommendations. Thank you.
We have just heard that radio is still an absolute mainstay of the media diet in Zimbabwe, and also we've learned about the enormous growth and potential of satellite TV in Zimbabwe. Now, for many of us, though, we have a challenge because of the restrictions that are imposed on the domestic broadcast market. We need to find other ways of communicating with Zimbabweans. And new media can actually play a pivotal role in bypassing those airwaves that we cannot get on domestically and reaching out directly to users in Zimbabwe. And we have looked at the development of new media over the past couple years. You can see these two green lines here that are fairly horizontal, those are radio and TV. What is much more interesting are those lines that show a really strong upward trend between 2010 and now. SMS has grown from just 47% 2 years ago to 70% weekly use currently, 71% weekly use currently. Also, social networking and weekly use of internet are now at 24% and 22% respectively. These two tools have more than doubled in weekly use in just the 13 months since between the fieldwork for the 2011 survey and 2012 survey. We further expect the growth of new media to continue in Zimbabwe as prices drop and as connection speeds finally get faster. However, before we get all carried away and sing the praises of new media as a golden bullet to reaching out to Zimbabweans, it's really important to be aware of the fact that new media is still largely concentrated in urban areas for the time being. Weekly SMS use in urban areas is getting close to universal with 87% currently, and even in rural areas, 64% is fairly high. However, the differences become fairly striking if you look at the clusters, the two clusters towards the right of the slide here, social networking and internet use. Those two are pretty high in urban areas at over 40%. However, once you go down to the rural areas, they're just at 15% weekly use. So just now we talked about the use of different platforms in general. Let's take a closer look at how people use different platforms specifically to get news, because this is a topic of interest to many of us here. And the platforms they use most frequently, we can see that in urban areas, urbanites use not only a larger variety of platforms, including word of mouth, TV, and newspapers, but also the new media differences here, again, are particularly striking. Social networking and internet use in urban areas is more than 3 times as high as it is in rural areas. So while in urban areas we do now have a sufficient amount of the population to make new media a viable tool of communicating, in rural areas this is just not given yet. And urban and rural are not the only differences in terms of access to new media. Education and to a lesser degree age also play a role, as we can see on this slide here. The highly educated, those who have at least who have any kind of post-secondary education, they are not only avid consumers of television, as you can see by the really high column here with 75% daily use for news, but also they are very avid consumers of new media. SMS and internet are used by over half of the highly educated on a daily basis for news, and social networking is also very high. Now, oftentimes social networking gets somewhat belittled as a source of news and information. But in Zimbabwe, we did ask regular internet users what their top news and information websites are specifically. What kinds of websites do you use for news and information specifically? And Facebook was actually mentioned by 3/4 of regular internet users. So Facebook goes beyond just the mere social contacts function. If you look at young adults, those under 30, the lightest colored column here on the left of each cluster, you can see that young adults are also stronger new media-based news consumers than the overall population, which is not a surprise, really. Now that we've learned a little bit about new media use in general, let's take a closer look at mobile phones and specifically who uses mobile phones. There are no big surprises in Zimbabwe at all. The groups that are most likely to personally own a mobile phone are the 25 through 34-year-olds. Some might be surprised that it's not the group 15 through 24, but this could often be explained by the fact that they might desire a mobile phone, but not yet have the means to personally own one. The urban population is very likely to own a mobile phone, and of course those with post-secondary education as well. In terms of ethnic background, Shona speakers are slightly more likely to own a mobile phone, with 73% of Shona owning a mobile phone and 53% of Ndebele speakers. What do people do on their mobile phone? Apart from voice calls, of course, which we do not measure, SMS is the primary non-voice activity, which is actually something that is absolutely common in markets that are still emerging, mobile phone markets, and where the smartphone penetration is just not very high. So SMS is the tool that is accessible even on dumb phones, so it is the most popular activity. That being said, Zimbabwe also shows fairly strong use of internet access, which is already the second most popular function here. 29% of mobile phone owners have accessed the internet in the week prior to the survey. 26% have accessed a social networking website, and 23% listen to the radio. Now, radio listening, just for the US-based folks here, that's usually, and generally when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, this is not streaming radio as it's very popular here. It is using the built-in FM chip on the mobile device to listen to radio. And you can see that young mobile phone owners use these activities to an even higher degree than mobile phone users overall. While young mobile phone owners use different activities to a higher degree, they are not necessarily more interested in using their mobile phone to get news and information. When we asked all mobile phone owners if they would be interested in receiving certain topics, information on certain topics on their mobile phone, young mobile phone users did in fact not express any higher interest than mobile phone users overall in a variety of topics. That being said, interest in general in receiving these topics is very, very high. You can see 90% of mobile phone owners would like to get news headlines about events around the country. 82% would like to get health advice, and also the other topics receive high marks. Now, I should caution here, we did ask the question specifically, would you be interested in receiving information on these topics free of charge? So once people have to pay, you can expect the level of interest will substantially decrease. Mobile phone is really the key means of accessing the internet. While there is substantial internet access at home, and I also should caution these two are not mutually exclusive. One can obviously access the internet at home through a mobile phone as well. Access at work, internet cafes, and school is less popular, which may also be linked to a certain fear factor, as every once in a while the government makes some effort to threaten to monitor activities there, although this has not been regularly enforced. When we ask people where do you actually access the internet the most from, 42%, the plurality said they access it from a mobile device, which obviously has very important implications on website design. Everything should be mobile friendly. Going now specifically into the internet, who uses the internet, and also important, who doesn't use the internet. Regular internet users, not very surprising, tend to be young, urban, male, and highly educated. Shona are a little bit more likely to access the internet, but even Ndebele speakers, 18%, access the internet on a regular basis. Now, who doesn't use the web at all? Also not surprising, those aged 55 and older and those without formal education. When people go online, what do? Zimbabwe is a good market to spread news and information because alongside email, finding out about the latest news and obtaining information about a specific topic online are the top popular activities amongst regular internet users. In fact, over two-thirds of regular internet users go online to find out about the latest news or to find information about a specific topic. On the other end of the spectrum here, you can see it on the right-hand side of your slide, the use of online videos or online audio is much less popular, which is something we frankly, quite often see in countries where mobile access tops fixed access, because mobile access obviously is data-intense. Activities such as online videos and audio are not only costly, but also can be a very frustrating experience if you have shaky networks and slow connection speeds, not to mention small screens. We have learned quite a bit about mobile activities and who the users are, but one more function of new media is also quite important, and I would like to highlight it today, which is the function of new media as a message amplifier. Besides the most basic form of information sharing, which is word of mouth and face-to-face conversations, new media affords some opportunities to spread messages instead of a one-on-one or one-on-5 basis directly to a much larger network. And this is a good opportunity for Zimbabwe because, as you can see on this slide here, Zimbabweans like to share news. In fact, half of them share news at least on a weekly basis with others outside their household. And young people do so a little bit more intensely even than a general population. And when we asked them, how do you share those news, we did find some significant use of more sophisticated techniques rather than just conversations. And these techniques are particularly embraced by young, frequent news sharers, such as those under 30. SMS, again, with the widespread ownership and use of mobile phones, not a surprise, is the top means of sharing news, but particularly amongst young people, Facebook and other social networking sites are a close second means of sharing news outside their direct household. So from what we've seen today, the notion that Zimbabwe is a radio-only market is now outdated. Radio is still obviously the key means of reaching the rural populations, the uneducated, and those in the older age ranges. But with the strong growth in new media and in TV, and particularly satellite TV, and those particularly in urban areas, it is time to use a multi-platform approach to communicate with different demographics. And that's it.
Thank you, Jenna and Sonia. We've got some time for some questions. If I just ask that you state your name and your organization. Adam, right in the front.
Do you have any indication? Oh, thanks. Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. Do you have any indication of what people are listening to or reading on their cell phones when they go to cell phones for news and information?
Sonia, you want to take that?
We do not ask a question specifically other than what activities they pursue online, we do not ask specifically what exactly are you reading. We do ask what topics in generally are you using in the media. Those are, as in other countries, news, health, information on jobs.
Okay, next question. Right there in the back.
Hi, I'm Nancy Coviello with the VOA Africa Health Network. I have a question about the marketplace competitiveness. Could you talk a little bit about each sector that you talked about, radio, mobile, TV, internet, and what does the landscape look like in terms of competition?
Jenna, you want to start with that? Maybe Sonia? Maybe some observations from your recent visit?
I can take it off top.
Okay.
Well, the competition in Zimbabwe is a little bit tricky because we have obviously restrictions on the domestic landscape. So the FM scene is pretty much dominated by state-run or state-closed stations. International broadcasters tend to come in through shortwave radio, some AM. But on the television market, it is very interesting because we do have this very high percentage of people who use satellite. They hence access foreign channels, and in fact, SABC is the South African public broadcaster, is amongst the top channels in Zimbabwe, right along with the public broadcaster. Now, this is something that could potentially change. I'm glad you brought up the question. It could change in the near future because currently there's a decision in an appeals court where the signal from South Africa might get encrypted much stronger in the near future, and then it would no longer be available on these pirate decoders. And if this happens, then this could shake up the entire TV market in Zimbabwe.
Joseph, right there in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Lawrence Green. I'm the Chief of English to Africa at VOA. Hey, Sonia. Could you talk a little bit about English speakers? I know you disaggregated for Shona and Ndebele, but English speakers are a part of the market, as well as English language consumption on all these platforms, mobile, TV, radio, et cetera. In particular, I'm guessing that a lot of the news consumed from neighboring countries is in English, for instance, from SABC, which you just mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, one thing I can tell you is that 52% of the population speak English well enough to understand all or most of a broadcast. This is the one figure that I have right in front of me, but the mere fact that stations like the South African TV or Botswana TV that all broadcast in English are very popular tells you that English does play a major role in the media landscape of Zimbabwe.
Also, if I could add, when I was there for our qualitative research, we heard a lot of people talking about how they really loved listening and watching the English programming because it helped their children learn English. And, you know, English is pretty pervasive throughout the country. So it definitely plays a big role in media there.
A quick follow-up. Did you actually ask or find out statistically from your sample group how many do speak or consume in English? Would you be able to break that out for me later?
Yes, we have the data.
Yeah, we
later.
could break that out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question. Quiet group today. Leah.
Hi, Leah Earmart, BBG. I was impressed actually with this, the response rate. Seemed high, maybe for Zimbabwe, not so much for other African countries. But what would you say was the, how did interviewers, how did the field team help folks get over the fear factor, which you mentioned on the first or second slide, to achieve such a good response rate?
Well, I think, you know, me personally, having spent time with the field team rather recently, you know, they're really trained to build rapport with their respondents, to really spend time with respondents in their households. And I think that, you know, if you have good people and good interviewers who understand what's going on in the country and who are able to overcome those obstacles, response rate won't be affected. And it wasn't here. I think this was a very high response rate.
Any other questions? I think we had one over here. Dr. Muller.
I was just going to ask, what news apps do they have available there now that would be something similar that maybe BBG would do in the future?
I am not aware of any mobile apps that are Zimbabwe specific, although I don't want to discard that there might be some available, but generally, just from research in other sub-Saharan Africas, one of our competitor apps seems to be fairly popular, which sounds fairly similar to our own name.
But there are apps available right now.
You can download apps, yes. And in fact, I think 6% of all users use apps for news specifically.
Right here.
My question was just sort of related to, in terms of response, which you thought was very healthy, but at the beginning of the presentation you thought that perhaps some of the answers you got weren't necessarily entirely truthful. Did you have any sense of the areas or where there might have been bias because of people's fear that you were related to the government?
So we obviously are just predicting that the political environment could have made people nervous about answering But definitely we asked some questions about, which types of media they trusted, any of the, like what they're actually watching, things like that. So I would say probably broadcaster-specific data is what people were probably worried about answering truthfully, but hopefully they did.
They're in the back again.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up. Mobile, since mobile is clearly, on the march, not in Zimbabwe and across sub-Saharan Africa, what is the mobile competitiveness like in Zimbabwe? Can companies get in there and start? What's it like?
There are quite a few mobile operators. Actually, I think it's either 5 or 7 currently. Somebody from the service might be able to correct me here. Most of them are state-owned, state-closed, and those do experience some sort of preferential treatment. One, for example, was blocked last year from upgrading their services, just so that the state-owned company would keep a competitive edge. So there are several operators operating, and the other thing is in border areas, because there has been so much emigration from Zimbabwe into South Africa, there are some who operate cell phones from South Africa, but only in the border regions.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let's give one final round of applause to our panelists today.